It's 6:30 and we like to start on time. Thank you for being here tonight. When I teach, I always want to have more people than less, but especially tonight when we are dealing with such an important subject, I was hoping to have people tonight, and I know that we have many on Zoom as well, which means that people are interested in the subject. So before I even define the subject, let me just tell you how the idea came about. October 7th, 2023, in the beginning, almost everyone supported Israel, right? But about, I think, 6 weeks later, the tide started to shift. And there were more and more arguments against Israel right even to be where it is, etc. And I read so many facts that were not true. And a lot of them were said in different universities, and our smartest kids in all these Ivy League schools just did not know how to answer. They did not know how to respond, because we Jews know many things about many subjects, but sometimes we don't know our own history well enough. Well, in the past year, it became really important to know where we came from, where we are now, and where we are going. As a Jewish people, and I will focus more closely on the modern state of Israel. I would like us in the next weeks to be able to build solid foundations of who are we, where we came from. And I think that when we fully understand it, we will be able to get a different comprehension of what's happening today in the Middle East. And when we hear from others, things like, oh, Israelis today are a bunch of colonials, we'll be able to say, no, that's not really true. Okay, so that's my main goal. I'm going to focus on history, the way it is perceived by historians or archaeologists, depends on the period. So the Bible is the most important book to us, but this is not a good source to learn history from. The Bible has never written as or never argued to be a book of history. The Bible mentions historical events, but not with the intention of being a history book. The whole concept of writing history did not exist. The Bible tells us about God and how God works in the world. Okay, so I heard some Jewish people arguing and saying something like, of course, the state of Israel is ours because God promised the land of Israel to Abraham. Well, it's really nice, but this is not a valid argument at 2024. That said, I'm going to start with the Bible and with God's promise to Abraham, because even though this is not history, it's really important for us to understand. And it happens to be the passage we read from the Torah last week. Okay, so this is the first time that God appears to a person and asks that person to be God's partner. And that person happens to be Abraham. His wife was Sarah. And they are the first Jews. Now, the word Jew is an acronym when I'm talking about Abraham. What do I mean by that? There were no Jews at that time. Abraham was a Hebrew. Okay, his title was a Hebrew. Jews is something that came much, much later as the descendants of the state of Judah, that you will understand what I'm talking about. However, often I will refer even to Abraham as the first Jew. But just for you to know, he was not a Jew. There was not concept of a Jew. Jew are the descendants of Judah, and Judah was the great grandson of Abraham. So he had not existed at that time. Those who try to locate or to place Abraham on any historical timeline would say that he lived around 1800 BCE or even 2000 BCE, which means 4,000 years ago. There is absolutely no proof that a man by the name of Abraham ever existed. And they cannot be, because Abraham was a man. He had a wife, Sarah. They had a tent. They had few sheep and few goats. That's not a history. You cannot find in the desert some remnants of an ancient tent that said, oh, this is a proof that Abraham ever lived. No, it was a family. Okay, and even his children later on were just, a larger family. And yet we look at Abraham and Sarah as our mother and father. But the reason I start with them, let me just read the first line that we read last week. The Lord said to Abraham, go forth from your native land and from your father's house to the land that I will show you. So God chose them. They were Mesopotamians, which today is Iraq. Okay, so if you really want to trace your backgrounds, you were all Iraqis, if you take it as real history. Okay, so we are from Iraq, which back then was the center of civilizations. Today is more or less the opposite of it. Okay, things changed dramatically. But we came, according to the Bible, from Mesopotamia, from Iraq. That's where we started. God told Abraham to leave that place and to go to a new place. And the importance of it is that from the very beginning, we connect three key elements in Judaism: God, the Jewish people, and the land of Israel, which at that time was called the land of Canaan. Okay? So the land from the very beginning was crucial to what it meant to be a Hebrew, an Israelite, or later on Jewish. This is not something that came about with the Zionist movement of the 19th century, or it has always been part, these three principles: people of Israel, God of Israel, the land of Israel. Okay, sometimes instead of God of Israel, you can call it the Torah, or the Torah of Israel. Okay? So that's really, really important to understand. Even if Abraham and Sarah never existed, the notion of this connection between the people, God, and a specific land is crucial. Okay? So that's, I said, not real history. If you believe in the Bible or the historicity of the Bible, by all means. But Israel as a fact, as a nation, we know existed for at least 3,200 years. Next week, I will give you a timeline. So those of you take note. Deliberately, I didn't want to give it to you today because some of you, like me, when I get a handout, I start reading the handout and I start jumping. So I wanted to talk a little bit more in general terms, but what I'm holding here will be yours next week with all the important dates to know, all the important historical events. So the first time I said was that we know of the existence of Israel was 1206 BCE. BCE is before the Common Era. I mentioned it in one of my talks during the high holidays. We know it from an extra-biblical source. What do I mean extra-biblical? This is biblical. Extra-biblical is other texts from the region, from the same time, that are not Jewish, they are not part of the Bible. So this very important source that I refer to is called the Merneptah Stela. This is a stone upon which the pharaoh Merneptah wrote the names of the nations that he destroyed. Okay, he went on a war the mighty Pharaoh of Egypt. And on the way north from Egypt, he destroyed some nations. One of the nations that he mentioned on the list is Israel. And Israel in the stela, if you go to the Cairo Museum, you can see it, if you read hieroglyphics, is mentioned as a state, as a nation, as a people, not as a family, not as individuals, but very clearly, like in English, we would say the state of, okay? So there is no doubt that at the year of 1206 BCE, 3,200 years ago, there was a nation by the name of Israel that resided in the area of Canaan, which is modern Israel today. This is a fact, okay? This is not something in the Bible that you may or may not believe, like Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and Jacob and the whole thing. This is a fact, okay, that has historical and archaeological proof to it. So when I speak about the beginning of Israel, some people like to say we existed 4,000 years, maybe, but at least 3,200 years that's we know of, okay? That Israel is mentioned outside of this book of our Bible, that other people recognized us as a nation. Okay, so when you will read, and you may read if you continue, that Israel just started much later, 1,000 years later, never existed before, it's simply not true, okay? By the way, a lot of modern scholarship is influenced by contemporary politics. So some people prefer, some Bible scholars, especially in Europe, have a tendency to interpret the Bible and archaeology to show that Israel is a much, much newer state than it was. And Israeli scholars and American scholars look at it differently, say, no, the facts are Israel existed for 3,200 years at least. What's the story with the Exodus? Right? Every Passover, we sit around the table, and before we eat, we tell the story of the Exodus from Egypt. And we know more or less the story, right? Abraham and Sarah had 2 children, but only one of them continued the line, which was Isaac. Isaac also had 2 children, and only one of them continued the line, that was Jacob. Jacob had 12 sons, and they became the children of Israel because Jacob's name was changed later on to Israel. Okay, so Jacob, who was Abraham's grandson, was born as Jacob, and then there is an episode in the Torah that after which God changed his name to Israel, which means one who struggled with God and prevailed. You couldn't find a more fitting name to the Jewish people. We struggle with everyone, with ourselves, and even with God. I think that's true. The more you learn about Jewish history, the more you see that it's actually quite true. And that's the way that's the name that we received. The one that or who struggles with God and prevails. So the Torah tells us the story that the 12 children of Jacob ultimately went to Egypt, were enslaved after a while, and then hundreds of years later, God freed them, God allowed them or helped them to leave Egypt. After 40 years in the desert, they made it into the promised land, to the land of Canaan or Israel, and that's how we started. It's a beautiful story. It's one of my favorite stories. There is zero proof that it ever existed. Okay? It does not mean, no proof does not mean that it didn't exist. But had something like that happened when 2-3 million people had fled Egypt, the Egyptians like to write everything, we would have found something. So how the Exodus story, the slavery in Egypt, became the foundational story of the Jewish people, I followed the scholars who said that probably there was a group of slaves who did leave Egypt, who did escape from Egypt. Later on, these people joined the ancient Israelites. But since the story was so compelling, we adopted it like it was our story. Because almost all the Israelites back then were just local Canaanites. They've never been to Egypt. Okay? But this group who were slaves somehow escaped, found refuge in Canaan, in Israel, became part of the Israelites. We love the story for so many good reasons, right? And that became our story. But we cannot cite the story of slavery in Egypt, neither the Exodus, as history. Other people may tell you differently, but if you follow history and archaeology, no proof yet, okay? And I told you, I believe that some of our ancestors experienced slavery in Egypt, experienced escaping from Egypt, but most of the Israelites were just local Canaanites that at one point decided to start something new. We don't really know why, but we know that they were not different than the others. Hebrew is Canaanite. If you speak Hebrew, if you read Hebrew, you read Canaanite. Okay, they look the same, they spoke the same language, they wore the same clothes, but they decided to start something new 3,200 years ago. And this is our story. That's where our story really begins, with a group of people who said, well, we're different. We want to live different life. We want to promote different ethics. We want to promote different relationship with God. That's the whole idea of the covenant. And that's where we all started. And where we did it? In the land of Israel, in the physical land of Israel, okay? Or Canaan as it was known. Any questions, any clarification? I know that I said something that may sound like heresy to some. No, but you know, when I teach Torah, it's the Torah, it's different. I teach the text of the Torah and how our rabbis learn great ideas from the Torah. But this is not a Torah study in this meaning. This is the most, call it scientific way to look at our roots. Okay? Any questions, any comments? Yes. Yes. I'll repeat the question. Where did the number 5,775 years came from? It came from when the Torah was first written, there were no real dates. But we decided, or later, towards the end of the editorial work of the Torah, they started to add numbers. And these numbers are complicated because there's a reason that Methuselah lived for 900 and something years and Noah lived for 850. Okay, they needed numbers to get to these 5,000 plus. Okay, it's a new, relatively in Jewish history, new idea. Okay, we use it, or you know, in Jewish context, but all Jews today, even in Israel, refer to today as November 12th, 2024. Okay, but on Rosh Hashanah, we like to say that I said that the Torah or the Bible is not a book of history. The Torah or the Bible is not also a book of science. If you want to learn how the world started, how the universe started, now, When you read the version or the story of the Torah, you will learn amazing things, but that's not physics or biology. Just the idea that God created human beings in God's image, okay, that's not necessarily a biological or scientific truth, but to think that every human being was created in God's image is huge. You know, I just came from Washington this afternoon, Washington, D.C., and you look at the Declaration of Independence, which had meant nothing and probably wouldn't have appeared without the idea that we're all created in the image of God. So there's tons of stuff to learn. This is by far the most important book, I think, in existence today, but not for history, not for poetry, not for science. It's for many other things, okay? So these numbers and others are wonderful, but not scientific. Other.
Hold on a second.
No, we need it for the Zoom. We have many people on Zoom,
okay.
and then they are frustrated not hearing
Hello?
the questions.
Can you just say again, when you said the first time that Israel or Canaan came into like the real history was that Pharaoh thing and the hieroglyphics and the list that he conquered?
Yeah.
What was it called then? Like what was written on the,
It's called Stela.
that was the name of,
No, Stela is a piece of stone, okay? I'm sorry that that's the only image I can come up with. Things about cemeteries with stones, when you engrave names and something other, that's the way that that's more or less the way the Merneptah stela looks like. And many of them exist in Egypt. And this is Merneptah was the son of Ramses II, if you want really to follow him. And he liked to report about his victories. So this is one stela that reports about his victories. Nobody would have paid any attention to this stela if the name Israel wouldn't have mentioned there.
so it said Israel in
It says the
hieroglyphics?
people of Israel were destroyed. Its seed is no more. Not in English, but that's the translation. Okay, so the Israel is destroyed, its seed is no more. Meaning I completely destroyed them. There is no Israel anymore. I had fun of it when I gave a sermon on Yom Kippur because of the irony that, you know, Israel exists very much today. And in many ways, Israel is doing so much better than Egypt today. Okay? But that's, I already gave the sermon. I'm not going to repeat it.
So going back to 1206 BCE, how does Israel back then in Canaan, how does that map to what we currently perceive as Israel with borders? How does that map to the West Bank, to Jerusalem, to Jordan, to Gaza? And does it matter?
So I will answer next week better than now. I'll bring a map. But this is, since you ask, I hate to tell people, I'll tell you next time. So I'll just give you a quick answer. And then next week, or in 2 weeks with a map, I'll show you much more. The original Israel resided on the hilly parts, not around the coast. So Gaza is or was a Philistine place. The Philistines was a nation that came from the Greek islands, and they understood the importance of being near the sea. So places like Gaza, Gaza was the southernmost Philistine area, and then you can go back along the coast if you want. Ashkelon and others, they were Philistines, which were the arch enemy of Israel. Okay? There were many other nations where modern Jordan today is. We had the Ammonites and the Edomites and others. But Israel, even Jerusalem at that time, was not part of Israel. That I'll mention Jerusalem in a short time. But really the area not by the sea, but in the middle, the hilly side until the Jordan River more or less was ancient Israel. Okay? Is it important? That's a discussion for later. But I can tell you one thing for sure, Gaza was never part of Israel. Okay? And of course, after what happened, no, we're talking history today. Okay. Oh, I wanted to mention before, I know that many of you know me, but some of you may not. I come here with tons of biases. I was born in Israel. I served in the Israeli army. My entire family is in Israel. Okay, so I really care about Israel. I will try to be as objective as possible, but you know where I'm coming from. Okay? So I had to say it. I'm not, at the same time, I have huge problems with the current leadership of Israel. So towards the end of these classes, you will hear more about it, right? I really think that the leadership now fails the people of Israel and failed the Jewish people around the world. That's another bias that I have, and I want you to know it, okay? But I don't know how, it's not relevant for now, but it's something that I wanted to be very clear about, okay? But really to understand the current situation, we have to build the foundations from the beginning. Okay, so. Oh.
What is the earliest records that they have from Canaan that we've discovered?
From Canaan itself. So the Canaanites were not so prolific. Here, in modern English, when you talk about Philistine, right? You talk about low-class people, they're like, right? The truth was that the Philistines were so much more sophisticated than the Israelites and the rest of the Canaanites, because again, they came from Greece. They were so much more advanced. We like to talk about periods, like the Iron Period. We're talking about the beginning, by the way, of the Iron Period, if you follow this kind of history. Okay, so we finished the late Bronze and we started the Iron. But for the Philistines, they started the Iron Era much earlier. The Bible has a beautiful little description that there was a war between Israel and the Philistines. There were so many of them. But there was no one in Israel who knew how to sharpen the swords. Only the Philistines knew, because we were the Philistines, I mean, intellectually and with regard to our knowledge. Okay, so we didn't write so much back then. We do have, that said, we do have some biblical parts that are from maybe not 3,200 years ago, but from 3,000 years ago. They find more and more all the time, but I think that the first time Israel is mentioned in Canaanite from that area, not from Egypt, is the 8th century, when they talk about the Israelite king Omri. But I will say a little bit more about it, okay? But solid, we have a really solid foundation that we existed as Israel for 3,000 years and more. Let me continue a little bit because I don't want to get stuck at the 1200 before the Common Era. So at that time, there was no king in Israel, and Israel was a confederacy of tribes. Okay? Somewhat loose confederacy of tribes. So we like to tell the story that are all descendants of our patriarch Jacob or Israel. That's why they're called the children of Israel. But that's Bible, not history. In any case, there were tribes. They sometimes had a better relationship than other times. What brought them together was a common enemy, back to the Philistines. It's important to know these Philistines. So if you think that problems from Gaza started today, no. More than 3,000 years ago, we struggled with Gaza too, only that back then there were the Philistines. So the Philistines were strong, the Philistines had better weapon, and often few tribes tried to fight against them, but without any success. When things were really, really bad, the tribes decided to unite, and instead of a confederacy, to form a country. And the person who was able to do that was King David. That's why King David is so important. Because for 200 years, there was Israel, but again, as a confederacy, different tribes in that area that had a lot in common, but didn't see themselves as one country. Think about Germany and Italy and others, just, right? They were different places until they were united by Garibaldi and others. So that's exactly what happened to ancient Israel by King David. That's why he's so famous. That's why he is so important. And that happened, and that's really easy to remember, at the year 1000 BCE, 3,000 years ago, okay? King David was very smart. He was a good leader, not as ethical and innocent as sometimes you want to think about it, but sometimes for leaders to achieve what they want, that was the style. So once he got rid of all his internal enemies like King Saul and all the family, he needed a place just like Washington, D.C., right? Washington, D.C. does not belong to any state. So he went, and with his personal army, King David had his personal army. There was the national army, and there was King David's personal army. So he took his personal army and conquered this little place on a little hill that was called Jerusalem. It was a Jebusite city. I'm sure you don't know the Jebusite, you never met a Jebusite, but this was one of the many ancient peoples who disappeared. All the people, by the way, from back then disappeared, except of Israel, okay? We were the only one who survived, they all disappeared. But there were the Jebusite, and David, with his personal army, conquered Jerusalem. That was really small, probably more or less the size of this temple, of the entire property. That was the original Jerusalem. Why is it so important that he did it with his own army? Because it belongs to him. Not to Israel, not to the people, but to David. Often, even when you travel today, they talk about the city of David. And we take it metaphorically, which is today. But back then, it really meant the city of David. He owned the deed on the place. And what he did with Jerusalem was to turn it into the political as well as the religious center for the people of Israel. Okay, so no tribe was able to claim Jerusalem. It belonged to him, and later on to his son Solomon. Okay? And that's why Jerusalem is so important. So when you ask me, Larry, is it important when it... so Jerusalem was conquered by us 3,000 years ago. We lost it dozens of times. No other city in the world has changed hands as often as frequently as Jerusalem. And I will demonstrate it as well. Okay, so we have the monarchy of Israel at the year of 1000 BC under King David. His son Solomon was the king after him. But if there's something true about us Jews, we like to disagree and to fight amongst ourselves. When King Solomon died, his son, his elder son, Jeroboam, was supposed to be the king. But King Solomon, in order to afford his lifestyle, his building endeavor, he built the first temple in Jerusalem, needed to levy a lot of taxes. And not like just taxes. He would go to the tribes and say every month a different tribe had to service, had to work for the monarchy for King Solomon. So as the Bible describes it, the women would be the cooks and the cleaners and the whole thing. The men would be the soldiers, etc., right? You can guess, right, that the people didn't like it. They didn't like to pay exuberant taxes. I think today nobody likes to pay too much taxes. Definitely did not like to pause for a full month to serve the king. There was one tribe that didn't have to do it. That was the tribe of King Solomon. Okay, so they were exempt. Didn't make him too popular, but he was really successful and very strong, and Israel flourished. And sometimes when the place flourishes, people are willing to take a little bit of unpleasant things from their leader. What was the tribe of King Solomon and King David? Judah. Jews are the descendants of Judah. Okay? Really important. In any case, the people of Israel came to the son of King Solomon and said, we would support you to be the next king of all of us, of all the tribes, but we need you to reduce taxes. We don't want to work so much. We don't want to send our children and men to fight and women to do other things, and enough is enough. Jeroboam was an interesting guy. So he had two groups of advisors. One were the elders, those who were his father's advisors. And he went and asked them, what should I do? You know, people want me to make all these concessions. And said, just say yes to everything they want. Let them elect you. And then change your mind. You can promise whatever you want before the elections, believe it or not, right? You can promise, make any promises, but then it will be too late for them. Because even back then, you could say that God wanted you to be the king. But if the people does not choose you to be the king, you're not the king, which is an amazing thing and quite unusual for the time. Okay, so it's not just God wanted me to be the king or I'm like God. No, yeah, that's very nice that God wants you to be the king, but you need our support. That has always been the case. So he went to the elders and said, just say yes to whatever they want, agree, and then do whatever you want once you're the king. And then he went to his buddies, his contemporaries, and said, what should I do? And they said, you should show them who is the man here. Because if you'll show any weakness, you're doomed. And he said to them something that I will say because I love the biblical language. He said that my pinky is larger than my father's penis. In other words, if you think that he was a big shot, I'm a much bigger shot than he was. And that was the language, because that's what his buddies used to talk like. I mean, okay? You didn't learn it in religious school. I promise you. I promise you, but this is really from here. I didn't make it up, okay? That was the language to show how tough he was. Well, the people of Israel were not impressed with his toughness or language or style and said, okay, bye-bye. So 10 tribes left, and he was left only with his own tribe, with Judah. And since that time, around 930 BCE, the number 70 is really important. So David and Solomon had the united monarchy only for 70 years. And then the people of Israel split into two nations. In the north, we had Israel. In the south, we had Judah or Judea. Okay? Only since then, we can talk about the Jews as the people of Judea. Okay? So we have two Israelite or two Jewish states now in this tiny region. The north, Israel, the south, Judea. Most of the time, they hated each other, but they still lived there, okay? So even though they didn't like each other, this area was still our area because the land was part of the identity of it, whether you're in Israel or you're in Judea, it didn't really matter, okay? So at 9:30 now we have two Israelite nations, Israel and Judea. You have a question? Go ahead. Just let Bruce give you.
What was the difference at that time between the Jews and the Judea? What was either in common or totally, why didn't they get along? Since the Jews were descendants of Judea, what's,
Again, they were united by David and Solomon, but they still had the identity of separate tribes, okay? And when the person from the tribe of Judea, Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, did not listen to them, they said, let's split again. Let's split off Judea. We just don't like these people. They assume too much. They didn't contribute anything. You know, they just take and take. We don't want much to do with them. So initially there was really no difference. Later on, they became two nations with two different temples, okay, with many different things. I will not dwell on it right now because I want to move. But that also didn't last for much longer because remember the year where we are now, 930 BCE. At 722, the Assyrians came. Assyria came from where today is Iraq, Syria, and conquered Israel and exiled the original people. So if you heard of the lost tribes of Israel, this is where it comes from. 722 BCE, the Assyrians exiled them all over the big Assyrian Empire. And since that day, there is no Israel. There's only Judea. Okay? We lost these tribes. Sometimes we read in the paper that there is a group somewhere in India, somewhere in Africa, that claims to be the original descendants of the lost tribes. Maybe I really don't know if it's accurate or not. Okay? So, two nations, Israel, Judea, to only one Judea. There was no Israel anymore. Why the Assyrians conquered Israel and not Judea? Real estate. Israel was located in a much better place. So when you travel in Israel to the north and you see all the beautiful green, that was Israel, okay? And when you make your living out of farming mostly, you want Israel. Judea is the south, is the desert basically. So they were not much, and they were not so interested in the desert. Okay, so Judea, if you want, is Jerusalem south, and Israel was Jerusalem north. And after 722 BCE, we have only Judea. Okay, now many of the people from the northern kingdom, from Israel, when they realized what would happen, escaped to the south. Because despite the disagreements between Israel and Judea, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, there was still one family. And when things are bad, you run away to your family. Okay, so those who were not exiled were able to escape south to Judea. Okay, so we don't have numbers. They didn't have census or anything like that, but we know that many people were able to escape from Israel, from the north to the south to Judea, and they were not exiled by the Assyrians. Are you overwhelmed with information or so far so good? No, I'm not going to spend 6 weeks just doing that, but it's really important to go to the very foundations. I really want us to understand the real thing, not just something that you heard somebody says, or this is really important. And all these little facts are crucial. Well, we have Judea, now no more Israel, and they did okay until they were able to piece off another empire. This time was the Babylonians, okay? And in the year of 586, in some places you'll see 587 BCE, before the Common Era, the Babylonians went and destroyed the temple that King Solomon built, exiled a lot of the local people from Judea, mainly from Babylon. Do you know the song, which is actually based on one of the Psalms, on the rivers of Babylon where we sat? And no, Bob Marley, and I'm not going to sing, and Marcy's not here. But, right, so we lost our, even Judea, but it lasted only for about 50 to 60 years because the Babylonians, who were the strong empire at 586, 87, lost to the new empire, the Persians. Have you heard of King Cyrus? We love King Cyrus because King Cyrus was the Persian emperor, and he told the Jews, as he told other people, you can go back to your land. Not only that you can go back to your land, I want you to do that. I want you to rebuild your temple. I want you to rebuild your culture, your religion. I don't want you to be Persians. You're different, you're Jews. Go back to your place. More than that, he helped them. He sent material help. He sent experts to help them to rebuild Judea, okay? That's why King Cyrus is so important. Now, I just want to give you another example. I said the Bible is not a history book, right? So the way the story appears in the Bible is that why the Jews or Judea lost to the Babylonians? Because they made God angry, right? Because it's all written in theological language, what God does and why God does. So we made God angry, we didn't follow God's rules, so God brought Nebuchadnezzar, he was the Babylonian king, destroyed our temple, exiled us. But then we were good again. We prayed to God, we repented, so God sent King Cyrus to send us back to our land, okay? Do you think that the majority of the people of the Judea, the Judeans or the Jews went back to Israel? No. Because after a while, you know, it's 50, 60 years, it's 2 generations or so, some of them did quite well. The story of Esther, the book of Esther, remember Haman and Mordecai and Queen Esther, the backdrop against which the story was written is the time in Persia, okay? In any case, many people stayed there because life was good. When they established the state of Israel, they thought that all the Jews will come to Israel. Well, that was not the case. Jews who did very well wherever they were, mostly in America, stayed in America. Why going to live in such a difficult place and to constantly fight when life was so good in the Golden Medina, right? But it's a natural thing. That was the case back then, but enough people went back and rebuilt the temple and reestablished Judea. But it was still under the control of Persia. We had a lot of autonomy, we had our rulers, we were able to worship the way we wanted, but we had, again, to pay tribute to Persia. But still, we like Persia. Persia today is Iran. It's amazing how things just work out. So Iran, I mean, Persia, back then, who was our benefactor and helped us to reestablish ourselves, today is our number one enemy. And by the way, before the revolution in Iran in 1978, Israel and Iran had wonderful relationships. Okay, so a lot of we cannot just zoom in today on some kind of relationship, assuming that that has been the case forever. Iranians liked us. Actually, they liked us a lot because, I'm sorry that I'm jumping a little bit, but they are Muslims, but they're not Arabs. Okay? Not all Muslims are Arabs, maybe are not, okay? So for them, they look down at the Arab Muslims, okay? But they were Muslims, Shiite Muslims, but not Arabs. So until at least the revolution, Israel had great relationship with them. And when you read the Bible, we celebrate King Cyrus and the Persians. They were really good to us, okay? But things don't stay the same. So we came back around 538, built the second temple. Okay, so we covered about 500 years. I'm not stopping here. Any comments, questions? Audrey, hi.
Audrey.
Thank you. So about when does the Bible start to become, or the Torah start to become a little more historic? I mean, go from what we'll just call sort of like fiction to then having more of a basis or interface with
Okay,
history.
thank you for this question. The book of Samuel and later the book of Kings focus on the history of Israel. In the beginning, the history of Israel and Judea. And some of the prophets, when you read the prophets, they talk about the history of the time. But it's really the books of Samuel and the books of Kings. And later on, there's a book that was written later. It's called the Books of Chronicles that write history. Okay? But I took an amazing class at graduate school, Bible at NYU, in which we had to read the Book of Kings. The prophet depends on the prophet, Isaiah or Ezekiel, and a lot of documents, extra-biblical from the same time. And you see, it's basically the same names and the same events, only described from different perspectives. Because, you know, the Bible at one time hated the kings of Israel because, so Samuel, Kings, and then Chronicles, they are the history books, but they're theology books, first of all, okay?
So we have Judea in the south and Israel in the north. Where did Samaria come from, the term Samaria?
Samaria was a different people. And when the people of Israel came back from Persia, from after the from the Babylonian exile, the Samaritans gave them a hard time. So these are the people of the east, right? Where is Syria, where is Iraq today? Okay, and they had issues with Israel, and it's actually fascinating, some of the relationship with them, because they wanted to be part of Israel. Israel didn't want to be really part of them, etc. But Samaria, this is the area that I'm talking about. Okay, but we will focus on Israel. But again, no Israel past 722 BC, only Judea. Okay. The next, so we talked about the Assyrians who destroyed Israel 722, the Babylonians who destroyed Judea at 586 and exiled and destroyed the first temple. We talked about the Persian Empire that allowed the Jews to go back and to reestablish themselves in Judea to build the temple. And now we are moving to a somewhat better known history that I think it's more Western history, and this is Alexander the Great. Okay, so now we go to Greece. I think he's a little bit better known than the people I mentioned so far. Alexander the Great, so my son asked me yesterday who I think was the greatest conqueror, the greatest leader ever, and I believe it was Alexander the Great. He died at his early 30s and was basically able to conquer everything. And he conquered also Judea. Okay, even the Talmud tells the story. We're talking about 322 BCE. Okay, we're getting close. So even the Talmud describes when he came and all admired him. And now Judea is under the control of the Greeks. Alexander the Great didn't care so much. It was good, just pay tribute, be happy, you don't have to do much. But he died, as I said, very young. And when he died, his kingdom was divided among his three main generals. And when you look at the geography of Israel, part of the reason that this tiny country with 9 million people, smaller than most states in America, is on the front page of the newspapers almost daily, okay? Part of it is also the geography. It just stuck there, this place in the Middle East. So when Alexander the Great died, one general was in charge or was placed around Egypt, which is close to the southern border of Israel. One was around Syria today, which is northeast, right? And Israel or Judea was in the middle. And they were fighting over it, okay? Because strategically, that area was important. So when two very small, large, powerful groups fight, who suffers the most? Those in the middle, okay? Before that, during the time, the 1200 BC, in the very, very beginning, there were other two main empires. We know of Egypt, right? Because you visited some museums and we know how advanced and how powerful some of the pharaohs were. Egypt is in the south of Israel. There was also a huge empire on the north of Israel, where Lebanon more or less is. These were the Hittites. When Egypt fought with the Hittites, where did they meet for their fight? In the middle. Where was the middle? Israel. Okay, so there are places, if you're interested, even today, there are some famous fights, battles like Megiddo and other places where the Pharaoh met with the Hittite, and who paid the price, the greatest price? The local population. Okay, so there were other events in history like that, that Israel was stuck between much larger and more powerful empires, just got stuck in the middle and paid the price for it. Okay, it was an important area geographically for different nations. Well, Alexander conquered, we're still under the control of the Greeks, but that at one point, oh, it's actually almost relevant. There was a group of the Syrian Greeks who decided not to allow the Jews to live their life the way they wanted. And we're getting to the story of Hanukkah. Okay? It's nice how everything falls now in historical context. So the Greeks started to control the area at 322, but the Greeks believe that the nations that they conquered didn't need to change. They didn't want people to convert to Greeks. Just live your own life. They believed in diversity, you know, live your own life. They introduced their culture, but they never imposed it or never forced it on anyone. You want to take it, take it. You don't want to take it, don't take it, okay? It's not some of the stories that we read that Jews had to choose between conversion or death. That was not the style of the Greeks. Many nations were influenced by them. You know why? Because they were good. They were so advanced, you know, walking for 2 days in Washington, D.C. looks like a Greek city. When you think about it, look at the architecture, so much Greek or Roman Greco influence still, okay? The Knesset, the Israeli parliament, is built like a Greek temple, okay? Still, the influence of the Greeks is huge today, and let alone at that point. So many people wanted to take a lot of the Greek inventions, the markets, the aqueducts, the way to transfer water along. They were really, really good. So the people of Judea, some liked it and said, well, we have to learn from the best, and the Greeks now are the best. Some said, no, we should not learn anything from the Greeks. We should be isolated. This is still a debate within the Jewish community today. Within Israel and even outside Israel, there are people who said everything new, every foreign influence is bad. Others said no. The reason we survived was that we learned from everyone and adapted it and contributed to where we were, okay? But that's not a new debate. In any case, again, the Jews were fighting amongst themselves. That's the story of Hanukkah. It didn't really start with a bad Greek person, as we teach often in religious school. The first casualty of the Hanukkah story was a Jew who was killed by another Jew. Okay, the real fight, or at least that's how it started, was between the Jews who wanted to adopt or to borrow more from the Greek culture. They called them the Hellenists, versus those who said, no, everything Greek is wrong. Okay, that was the real tension between Jewish groups there. And of course, as the Jews have been doing so often during the history, one group went to that faction of the Greek, that group went to others, and the Jews got stuck in the middle. In any case, when things were really bad, and that particular Greek ruler forced the Jews to fundamentally change what they felt was like a red line that they refused to cross, like putting a statue of Zeus in the temple, sacrificing pigs. No matter how much they were willing to learn from the Greeks, there are lines that you're not willing to cross. The Jews decided to rebel against the Greeks. And this is the story of Hanukkah. And the Jews won this battle, mainly because the Greeks were so busy fighting in so many other areas of their empire, but also because it was a guerrilla fight, and the Jews knew the area very, very well, and the Greeks didn't. And when you think of all the wars where a big army tries to fight guerrilla soldiers, it's hard. You saw enough stories about Vietnam and others. It's really, really hard. They know the area. That's why Israel has the Israeli soldiers are being killed constantly in Lebanon now, okay? Because the Lebanese know the terrain. The Israelis, as good as they are, find it hard. It was much easier in Gaza. But the terrain of Lebanon, and I have been there, is so difficult that the Hezbollah and the Lebanese have the advantage. And I know it's not, you don't see it in the American papers, but almost every day you open the Israeli paper and you see 3, 4 pictures of dead Israeli soldiers. Something that did not happen a lot in Gaza, but happens much more in Lebanon. During the fight of the Maccabees against the Greeks, it was the other way around. We had the advantage because we knew the terrain and the geography of the areas. The Greeks didn't. Okay, we were the small army fighting against this huge army who didn't know what they were doing. But the importance of that, the data that you want to remember for that is 167 BCE. Okay, so we almost come to the beginning of the Common Era. The importance is that for the first time, we had complete sovereignty of the land. The Maccabees or the Hasmoneans, that was the family that was in control, really, we had the sovereignty. Before that, we had to pay tribute to the Assyrians, to Babylonians, to the Persians, to the Greeks. But 167, the story of Hanukkah, we're free. Didn't last for a long time, for less than 100 years. Okay? I think I will stop here for now because next, yeah, I think we covered 1200 years. Is that good enough or? I know that today I had a lot of material that I assume, I don't want to sound pretentious, but is not part of the regular curriculum of people who go to school or even universities in America, unless that's their field. So I talked a lot about things that are less known, but as we start to talk about the Common Era, right, from the time of the Romans and the time of Jesus, etc., things will start to make more sense. So let me just summarize the whole thing and why I needed these, or I think we need to know these details, and I will give it to you. Don't worry, you don't need to remember. Because despite all the exiles, despite all the defeats, despite being under the control of so many different countries and empires, we always stayed in our land. There were many Jews all over, right? In the Babylonian Empire and the Persian Empire, and they're important, but the center was always in Judea, or Israel in Judea, later on the Romans will call it Palestine. Okay, we'll talk about it next week. But the connection of the people of Israel, the God of Israel, and the land of Israel was crucial. Even people who lived in exile kept praying for return to the promised land. Okay? This is not a new idea that started in 1948 or with the Zionist Congress. Okay? This has always been in our blood as a huge part of our identity. No matter how difficult things were, no matter what a huge price we had to pay, the Israel or Judea or Palestine or Canaan or this geographical area was a major part of who we were. Okay? So when you hear people say, no, the Zionists just started 100 years ago and came up with, no, it's really not true. And I'm not saying it because of my biases, just because it's not true. Not only that this land was crucial to us, we always kept the language. You know, Hebrew was revived as a modern language recently, but we read Hebrew, we prayed in Hebrew, okay? And this is the language of the area, no matter where we lived. We spoke other languages, but we prayed in Hebrew, okay? So this connection has always been crucial. I'll tell you later on, some people talked about it in different ways, and this whole Zionist idea is fascinating. But we covered 1,200 years of ups and downs of all the Jews living in the area, less Jews living in that area, but that was still the center. Okay? I think I made my point clear. Next week? Okay. If you have any question that you want, especially about it, let's say from 1200 BC to 0, to year 1, or to the birth of Jesus, I don't know what's the most important date of that, bring it next week. And we'll talk about it, and then we'll continue with the Romans and some other interesting stuff. Okay? Thank you.